Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the harrowing 1620 survival story of the Pilgrims. We're going to unpack exactly how a tiny group of religious separatists managed to overcome virtually impossible odds. We're talking about a wild story of struggle, unlikely alliances, and just sheer endurance.
So, let's kick things off with a pretty massive question. Would you risk absolutely everything for freedom? What does it truly take to just pack up and leave your entire world behind solely for the right to practice your own faith? It's really easy for us to look back at history as, just words in a textbook. But imagine actually having to make that choice. The Pilgrims were a group of English religious separatists in the early 1600s who faced such severe persecution back home that staying just wasn't an option anymore. They had to risk it all.
And this definitely wasn't a simple point A to point B journey. These separatists actually fled England for the Netherlands first, hoping to find some tolerance. But they eventually realized they needed to forge an entirely new path if they wanted to truly establish their own tight-knit community. So, leaving literally everything familiar behind, they set their sights on a totally unknown land. They boarded the Mayflower in September of 1620 and eventually hit the coast of present-day Massachusetts in November of that same year.
Now, this stark physical reality of this journey really comes down to this: exactly 102 passengers. 102 people packed tightly onto the Mayflower. And here's the crazy part. This wasn't some luxury passenger ship built for a transatlantic crossing. No, it was a merchant vessel. It was originally used for transporting wine. The living quarters were unimaginably cramped. We're talking about a space just about 80 feet long and barely wide enough to walk across. That tiny space carried all the hopes and honestly all the terrifying fears of this entire community attempting a massive relocation.
And they were trapped inside that dark, damp, wooden hull for over 2 months. Just picture that for a second. Spending over 60 days confined in a foul-smelling, constantly rocking space, completely at the mercy of the ocean. Sickness spread like wildfire, the food was just cold and hard, and the sheer claustrophobia of being locked below deck while massive storms raged outside, it's an incredible testament to human endurance.
There's this really grim contrast between their lofty ideals of religious freedom and the brutal reality they were facing. Those 2 months were an absolute nightmare. Endless storms, rough seas, freezing conditions. They were being violently tossed around the Atlantic, suffering through severe weather that constantly threatened to sink their little ship before they even had a chance to start their new lives.
So after all that, they realized they'd been blown way off course. They were arriving completely on their own, way further north than their intended destination in Virginia. That meant there was 0 established English laws waiting for them. 0. Realizing this, they drafted a desperate last-minute survival agreement before even stepping foot off the ship. We know it today as the Mayflower Compact. They knew that if they didn't figure out a way to work together right then and there in that wooden cabin, they were absolutely going to fail.
And this wasn't just a basic list of do's and don'ts. It was a foundational early American example of self-government. For its time, this was completely revolutionary. Instead of just waiting around for a king across the ocean to tell them what to do, they actively agreed to bind themselves together. They chose to govern their community through fair laws and cooperation. It was a conscious choice made for the common good, and it set a really remarkable precedent for the future of America.
Okay, so with this pact firmly in place, the Pilgrims officially founded Plymouth Colony. They had their rules, they had their land, and they had their community. But as you can probably guess, establishing a colony on a piece of paper and actually surviving in a harsh new physical environment, those are two very, very different things. The real test? Well, the real test was just beginning.
50%. I really want to let that staggering mortality rate sink in for a moment. Out of the 102 brave souls who boarded the Mayflower, almost half of them died during that devastating first winter in Plymouth. Half. It's an absolutely brutal reality check that shows just how incredibly perilous, how life or death their situation truly was.
The remaining colonists were pushed to absolute rock bottom. Disease, severe hunger, and unforgiving, harsh weather just completely ravaged the group. You see, they had arrived right at the onset of a brutal New England winter. They were in a climate they were entirely unprepared for, they didn't have adequate shelter, and they definitely didn't have the necessary food reserves to sustain themselves.
So how did anyone survive at all? Well, salvation came directly from local Native Americans. They provided literal life-saving, hands-on knowledge. They stepped in and taught these desperate colonists how to grow local crops, things like corn, beans, and squash, in soil that was totally unfamiliar to the English. They taught them how to successfully fish the local waters and, broadly, just how to adapt to this entirely new environment. Let's be clear, without this critical intervention, Plymouth Colony almost certainly would have collapsed completely. One man in particular, named Squanto, played a uniquely vital role as a mentor and an ally. He actually used his ability to speak English to guide the settlers back from the brink of extinction. And his backstory? It is unbelievable. Squanto spoke English because years earlier he had been kidnapped by an English explorer, sold into slavery in Spain, managed to escape to England, and eventually found his way all the way back across the Atlantic to his homeland. Having him there to communicate and bridge the gap was just a massive, unimaginable stroke of fortune for the Pilgrims.
Because of all this help, in less than a year, they experienced an unbelievable reversal of fortune. Think about this contrast. They went from losing 50% of their population to freezing cold and starvation to suddenly celebrating a bountiful, incredibly successful harvest. It's got to be one of the most dramatic turnarounds in history. And again, made entirely possible by the agricultural knowledge shared by their Native American allies. To celebrate this successful harvest, the settlers and Native Americans shared a historic feast together. We all know it today as the first Thanksgiving. But back then, this wasn't just a nice dinner party. It was a profound shared feast of sheer survival and immense gratitude. It marked this rare, beautiful moment of peace, cooperation, and shared relief after a year that was characterized by unimaginable suffering and hardship.
And the news of Plymouth's ultimate survival? That sent a massive chain reaction back across the Atlantic. It proved to folks back in Europe that life in North America was actually possible, and it inspired countless other English settlers to make that difficult journey themselves. It basically served as the ultimate proof of concept for future voyagers looking to forge a brand new life.
So what began as this tiny group of 102 terrified people fleeing persecution eventually transformed into a critical foundational chapter that led directly to the creation of the United States. Armed with literally nothing but their faith in the Mayflower Compact, they laid down these deep roots of self-government and endurance, roots that would eventually become woven into the very fabric of an entire nation.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, kind of provocative thought to chew on. Without Native American help, would the United States even exist today? The history we just walked through proves that the Plymouth colonists were teetering on the absolute brink of total failure. Their survival hinged entirely on the grace, knowledge, and cooperation of local Native Americans. It's a pretty powerful reminder of just how deeply interconnected our history truly is. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey,